Okay, to start this video, I'd like you to think about the equation b times x is equal to x. So for a constant b, that just means a number. Like it could be 2, it could be -7, it could be pi. For a constant b times an x value, the answer is x. So I want you to think about what value of x would make this true where b is any constant. So it can't be 1 because 1 times b is not always just equal to 1, it's equal to b. It would have to be 0 because if we plug in a 0 for x, we get b times 0, any constant times 0 is equal to 0. So that's called the zero product property. Any number multiplied by 0 gives us the answer of 0. Second graders know that, but we have a name for it. It's called the zero product property. So if I had this equation, like 3 times x is equal to 0. Well, if two things multiply to 0, one of them has to be 0. So that means that x would have to be 0. If I have 3 times x minus 3 equals 0, if two things multiply to 0, one of them has to be 0. So that would work if x minus 3 was equal to 0. If I had x minus 5 is equal to 0, or x minus 5 times x plus 1 equals 0, then we have two options. Either x minus 5 equals 0 or x plus 1 equals 0. If we need our answer to be 0, then either one factor or the other must equal 0. Because to get a product of 0, one of the numbers must equal 0, or one of the factors must equal 0. Okay, so we're going to use that idea when we solve these equations by factoring. So the first thing we have to do is get them in standard form. But if you notice, examples 1 through 5 and the two you-try problems at the bottom are already in standard form since we have them equal to 0 and they're written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay, so we're ready to dive in and start factoring. As you know, the first thing we look for when we factor is a greatest common factor. Example 1 has no greatest common factor, so we're going to factor it by product sum method. So -4 and +2 are the factors that we're needing here. So now if we have two factors that multiply to 0, either x minus 4 equals 0 or x plus 2 equals 0. And then we solve for x and we get x is equal to +4 or x is equal to -2. So those are the two solutions to this equation. So we call those things solutions or roots. What would they tell us about the graph? They would tell us when the graph has x-intercepts or where the graph has zeros. So these answers kind of have four names. If we're solving an equation, which is what we have when our equations equal to 0, these things are called solutions or roots. If I were to call the function f of x equals x squared minus 2x minus 8, and I were to solve for its x-intercepts, I would get the same value, and I would call those the x-intercepts or the zeros of the function. They have a slightly different name when we have a function here as when we have an equation. We'll talk more about the differences in those names as we go through this unit. Example 2, there is no common factor, so I'm going to factor it as a difference of two squares. I'm going to get 2x minus 1 and 2x plus 1. Now if I have two things that multiply to 0, either the first factor equals 0 or the second factor equals 0. Now we just solve. So I'm going to move the 1 to the other side and then divide by the 2. So one of my solutions is x equals 1/2. On this one, I think you can see if you move the 1 to the other side, it becomes -1, and then when you divide by 2, you get -1/2. Okay, example 3. We again have a standard form of a quadratic equal to 0. So we're going to factor out a greatest common factor of x. So factoring out a greatest common factor of x, we have x minus 6. So again, we take each factor and set it equal to 0 and solve for x. Well, x minus 6, when I solve that, I get x equals 6. Over here, this one's already solved. So one of my solutions or one of my roots is x equals 0, and the other one's x equals 6. Okay, next, let's factor a negative out of the whole thing because, as you know, the first thing we look for when we factor is a greatest common factor. So factoring out the negative changes the sign on all of the terms. Let's keep that negative in front. I'm actually going to put a negative 1 just for a conversation we're going to have in a minute. Let's factor as a product sum method. So factoring using product sum, we have plus 3 and then minus 2. So now I set each factor equal to 0. I have this factor here of negative 1, but when I try to set that equal to 0, there's no x to solve for, so that does not give me a solution. Negative 1 does never equal 0. And besides, there's no x to solve for. Okay, let's set the next factors equal to 0. So you can skip this step that I'm doing now. If you can tell how to go straight from the factored form to the solution, go ahead and skip that second to last step. Parabolas usually have two solutions because they usually cross the x-axis twice. But there's exceptions. Okay, next. There's no common factor to factor out, so we're going to factor this by using guess and check. Since 7 is prime, I'm going to put a 7 in and 1 here, since I don't need to do any guessing and checking with the 7 and the 1. Let's go ahead and guess and check with the 6x squared, so I could have a 6x times a 1x, or a 2x times a 3x. I need the middle one to be 19. I'm going to go with, let's do a 3x here and a 2x here. I didn't work this out ahead of time. I'm just kind of thinking it through as I go. So this guy, when you multiply the outer product, we get 2x. Multiplying the inner product, we get 21x. That can give us a sum of 19 in the middle if I make the 7 positive and the 1 negative. Let's see if that works. So if I FOIL it out, first times first, I'm just going to check down here, is 6x squared. My outer product is now a negative 2x. Inner product is 21x. So when I add those, I get 19x. And then last times last, I do get negative 7. So that factoring checks out. Now I'm going to take each factor and set it equal to 0 and solve. So on the first one, I bring the 7 to the other side. And again, this step I'm doing now, this is optional. And divide by 2. So you can skip that second to last step and go straight to the answer. Let's bring the 1 to the other side, and we get x is equal to 1/3. Solving by factoring. So we're going to make sure we have standard form, factor it, and then set each factor equal to 0 and solve for x. Go ahead and try the ones at the bottom if you wish, and you can just go ahead and proceed and go to your homework.